So we are continuing on our journey with Peter, and we're using Come Thou Fount to do that. Every week we've taken a line from that, and we've looked at what we can get as disciples from Come Thou Fount, and as we look at Peter's journey. Today we see Peter asking Jesus about forgiveness. He wants to be taught. Last week we saw when Peter was rebuked by Jesus, and he could have easily walked away from discipleship saying, this is not for me, but he kept on going. And so today he's listening to Jesus tell this story. And in the passage for today, you might have noticed that Jesus talks about church. Well, how many of you remember that little rhyme we used to do as kids? If you do, follow along with me, the hand actions. This is a church. This is the steeple. Open the doors. Here are the people. Yeah. But my question for you is this church, this steeple, this open the doors, is this the church that Jesus is talking about in this passage when he says if that person refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church? And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let it be one, such as a Gentile and the tax collector? Is that the church that Jesus is talking about? Well, the answer is yes and no, but mostly no. Because when we read and hear the word church, we think about the church we grew up in. We think about this church. You probably think about the church you were baptized in, or the church where your children were baptized in. Maybe you think about the church where you met your significant other, or maybe you've gotten married in a church that comes to mind when you hear the word church. But when Jesus wandered the earth, when the disciples were with him, there was no church as we understand it. There was no church, there was no steeple, there was no cross, because Christianity did not exist then. And Jesus was not crucified yet. He had not risen as yet. So church is not what we think of when we hear that word. In fact, the Greek word here is the term ecclesia, which means assembly or gathering. And in ordinary Greek, when it was used in this passage, it referred to an assembly of people, citizens of a city, gathering together to decide on political issues, adjudicate local matters. They were legal courts. So in most modern English, that noun, church, doesn't correspond with that word ecclesia that we normally translate as church. Gathering is a much better word than church. And the gatherings that they were talking about, they would look like this. There were probably 5 to 10 people, probably 20. Most of the time, these ecclesia were a time of eating and drinking and talking. They bore no resemblance to the modern worship service of today. They more resembled our church suppers. So how did church become the translation for ecclesia? Well, let's get a little Greeky and geeky. The 5th century Cappadonians, they spoke Greek, and they called their communities Kyriakos Oikos, the Lord's house. And they had a major influence on the translation of the Bible into Gothic, an old Germanic language. And the Gothics rendered it Kyriakos Oikos, and I'm butchering the Greek here. And they call it Syriac. And then the name Syriac became the English word kirk. And then from that, and you probably still hear the word kirk today. Some churches still refer to their church as a kirk, also spelled Kirk. And that's how we got the name church. But the word, as we know it, is not what Jesus was talking about. Why am I telling you that? Because we often think that what Jesus is talking about is only for this body. But that's not what Jesus was intending. Jesus was intending that we're meant to be in a gathering with each other. We're meant to come together as God's people concerning disputes and every other aspect of our lives. And throughout Scripture, you can see that the people are trying to learn how to do this. They're trying to learn to be in relationship with each other through their understanding of God. We even see people evolve in their understanding of what God desires for us, how we're supposed to be in community with each other when we get along and when we don't get along. So if you look at the creation story, we're going way back now. If we go into the creation story, we were supposed to be in close relationship with each other and with God. But as you know, humans, as represented by Adam and Eve, decided that they wanted to be like God, not just be in relationship with God. They didn't want to have to rely on God. So because of their decision, they had to leave that sacred space where they could walk hand in hand with God, where they fully relied and trusted on God, where they had a lush provision of food. And when they left that place, it may have felt to them that God abandoned them, but God didn't. God showed them grace and forgiveness by clothing them so that they would no longer feel ashamed and aware of their nakedness when they ate of the fruit. Outside the garden, God still graced them. Although God didn't just provide for them anymore, God allowed them to work the land, to plant things, to grow, and to hunt. From the very beginning, we see God's grace and forgiveness. But then things get worse. They're outside of the Garden of Eden, and their firstborn Cain is offended by his brother Abel. And what does Cain do? He murders his brother Abel. And so there's consequences for that. We all have to face consequences for our actions. And once again, God pushes Cain further away from that sacred space of the Garden of Eden. Cain can no longer reside with his family. He's driven away to a place where there is no hope of agriculture for him. Even though Cain was the gardener, Cain was a person who's supposed to grow things and reap them. But now he has to become a hunter, like the brother who he murdered. He thinks God has abandoned him. But once again, God shows grace and forgiveness just as God did to Adam and Eve. And God says, Cain, I will protect you. Cain's worried that other people will come after him. And God says, no. I'm going to put a mark on you, a mark of grace and a mark of forgiveness, just as I did with Adam and Eve in clothing them. And nobody can harm you. And if they do, they're going to receive sevenfold vengeance to anyone who harms him. Well, you think humanity would have learned by then. But no, it gets worse. Because Cain's great-great-grandson, Lamech, takes it upon himself to wreak vengeance upon somebody. He says to his wives, he says, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. I have killed a young man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. And if Cain can be avenged sevenfold, then truly Lamech can be 77-fold. So 7 and 77. So things are escalating. People now just want to not just get justice, they want to have vengeance and they want to multiply it. Just for wounding him, Lamech has killed somebody and he has decided that he will get 77-fold the vengeance. He takes punishment up a level. There's no limit to revenge or hatred in this community. If you wound me, I will kill you. If you strike me, you will die. And that's the kind of thing that we tend to magnify other people's wrongdoings and we minimize our own. And when this continued in society for a while until Moses receives the 10 Commandments. And when Moses received the 10 Commandments, he brings forth laws that flow out of those 10 Commandments. The people had come out of exile, they had come out of slavery, they were trying to be a free community. They're trying to figure out how they were supposed to live as a community. And so Moses sets out all these laws for them as best as they can, bearing in mind this community of God. And so this is where this famous statement comes from that we all know, where it says, if there's a serious injury, you are to take a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on. Oftentimes, people see that as justifying vengeance. But really, what Moses is speaking to here is to not seek vengeance, but to have limited equal measure of justice on hand. So you cannot, just because you've been wounded, kill somebody. You have to measure out the justice that is given. Today, we see Jesus is reframing even that. There's a lot going on in this passage today. But one of the things that Jesus is teaching everybody to do is to be a community framed by the love of God. He's teaching another thing. He's teaching that all the disciples have the authority to take this on. So when he says, truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. There's a lot of debate about what that means. But one of the things that means is that before, only the Pharisees, only people with legal authority, only priests could have the divine authority to offer forgiveness or offer justice of some kind. Here, Jesus is saying, no, all of you have the authority, the divine authority to give forgiveness, to offer justice in the way that I have told you. Before, it was only the Pharisees could do this because they believed that the Pharisees had the divine authority to give laws. They believed that the Pharisees and others of law had a process where they could decide who can be reconciled, who could be punished, who could be banished, either by flogging or stoning or whatever. So now Jesus is saying, no, you have that authority, that whatever is bound on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever is loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven because I have given you that authority. But here's the authority that Jesus has given them. Jesus is calling them to a process of prioritizing reconciliation, not vengeance, not punishment. Jesus is saying, punish only if reconciliation fails. He's democratizing legal power because in the old society, it was only the scribes who could do it. Now it's the whole community. Legal authority is given to the community versus the ruling class. The other thing I want to tell you is that this verse. I wanted to just address this verse because it's been misused by the name it and claim it society, right? The name it and claim it. Like God says, you just have to be there 2 or 3 in my name and you will get whatever you wish for. And what Jesus is saying, in this community, we need to have people who can be witnesses, people who can say that, yes, an injustice has been done. So we're not just going to meter out justice just because. We're going to say that everybody needs somebody who can stand by them. So where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among you. But this relates to the Deuteronomy passage. One witness is not enough to convict anyone. So we can't just randomly accuse somebody of something. We have to give that person a chance to be heard and to ensure that that person is being accused in a right way. Hearing all of this, hearing that the community is now given this authority, Peter rightly asks a question. We might think Peter is being funny. Well, Lord, how many times? Should it just be 7 times in the way that you did it for Cain, that God did it for Cain? He's not trying to limit it. He thinks he's being generous. He thinks 7 is a lot. And Jesus amplifies that. Jesus is saying, look, just like Lamech wanted to take vengeance 77 times, I am telling you, seek reconciliation just as much. I'm asking you to forgive just as much. It's hard. Forgiveness is hard, and I didn't want to get up here and preach to you that you should forgive. Because as soon as we talk about forgiveness, we think about that person who has wrongly done something to us. We think about the person that it seems the hurt is too much. We think about that forgiving them means we're supposed to reconcile with them and we're supposed to become best friends with them again. But I think from this and from other things that I have read, forgiveness is an internal process. Forgiveness is something that is internal, that is felt outwardly. Just like injustice is not only affecting the person who feels the injustice, it affects the whole community, so too is forgiveness. Most people think forgiveness is interpersonal, between 2 people, that I have to do something for you. I am providing something for you. But it starts within. And what changes when we think of forgiveness is that we can think of it as that letting go process we often hear about. We can let go of the hostility that we have towards a person and that need to seek vengeance at that person. We think about it as, sometimes we think about it as contingent on what that wrongdoer has to say, that that wrongdoer has to repent, that wrongdoer has to reconcile first. And Jesus talks about that. In the passage, you heard that Jesus said, yes, let them go to them and let them recognize their fault. But if they don't, he says, then treat them as a Gentile or a tax collector. And we think, oh, Jesus is saying, abandon them, treat them as an outcast. But in all our passages, how has Jesus ever treated Gentiles and tax collectors? Jesus has never treated a tax collector or a Gentile as an outcast. Jesus has always recognized the goodness in them. Jesus even invited a tax collector to be one of his disciples. It's about keeping community, not harming the other person. I think when Peter asks how many times I should forgive, it's not that we should cut them off at any point. I think that Peter is also talking about a process that's involved in the act of forgiveness, and that sometimes it takes time. Maybe you've been shamed into giving forgiveness to somebody because you are Christian. Maybe somebody harmed you and another person said to you, you are Christian and therefore you need to forgive. And I don't think that that's what Jesus was saying either. It's a process. And your process and my process might look different depending on our personalities, depending on the experiences, depending on the harm and the nature of the sin against us. How important it was to us, whether the harm was to our sense of self or the degree of harm, whether it was physical or mental, all of these impact our capacity to forgive and the process of forgiveness. And there are times when we've probably forgiven something, we've probably worked through the negative feelings, and we've worked at transforming them within us, But then something else happens, a life transition happens, a crisis happens, a developmental stage happens, and those negative feelings may arise again. We often think we're supposed to forgive and forget with forgiveness. And we just can't. We're not built that way. Unless we have some traumatic brain injury, and we are not going to forget. And to deny that is not real. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. Forgiveness is not a one and done thing. There are many things that impact forgiveness. And I don't think Jesus is calling us to just forget when Jesus says, treat them as a Gentile or a tax collector. Jesus knows that tax collectors have harmed the fellow Jewish people of his community. Jesus knows that there is a difference between Gentiles and the Jewish people, and yet Jesus is still saying they are still children of God. And you are to welcome them as a child of God. And it doesn't mean reconciliation, and it doesn't mean forgetting, but it does mean just as you have been forgiven, you are to forgive. Unforgiveness rather, is seen as a stress reaction. The first thing trauma survivors need to do is to tend to their own healing. And this is not me saying this. This is, I've been reading up on this from psychologists. And they say that unforgiveness is a stress reaction. And the first thing we want to do is we want to hold on to that almost as a protection. But for our own healing, we are called to forgive. More and more, the advantage of forgiveness is being learned about for mentally and physically as well. But forgiveness is not always the most appropriate response immediately after a trauma. Fear and stress and anger signal that our bodies have experienced something wrong. And if somebody has harmed us, forgiveness does not mean forgetting that that person might be harmful again, especially if they're a predator or unrepentant or abusive in any way. And Jesus has recognized that there are some people who will be unrepentant. Forgiveness can be dangerous if it leads to re-engagement in relationship with somebody who's likely to harm again. But in all of that, Jesus is saying, forgive. Let it be that internal process. remember that you are forgiven through God, and let that person still be a child of God as well, because you cannot change that anyway. Part of our Christian identity calls us to decide to forgive, calls us to decide to forgive, and to be committed to the process of forgiving. The decision to forgive is an intentional one, because forgiving does not happen naturally. And that's why Jesus has sat them down and told them about this. Will we always reach whole and complete forgiveness? Maybe not. I think that's part of our humanity. We are not God. God can forgive wholly. God can receive us wholly. But are we supposed to work on it? I believe so too. We can make the decision to forgive. I think that's the first step. And it can take some time, and we're not to be rushed. But we're called to that decisional forgiveness, and then emotional forgiveness as well. I think that 77 times that Jesus is talking about is telling us, just like Lamech thought he deserved to avenge himself, we are called to seek that forgiveness. It's not a magic wand. Forgiveness will not make everything disappear. Jesus is saying you might have to forgive again and again, but from the very start, we have seen that relationships are hard. And part of our relationship, just as God did, just as God laid his mark on us over and over again, God is calling us to remember that mark and to seek to give forgiveness as well. This is a quote from one of a psychologist who was speaking about forgiveness. And she says, what is happening with Israel and Palestine is an example of the traumatized becoming traumatizers who create other traumatizers in this vicious circle. The people of Israel who have this historic, horrific oppression and trauma form this new political entity, a nation out of that. And out of that desire to protect themselves, they end up harming other people. Then those people who, after decades of experiencing harm, lash out against the people who are harming them in horrific ways. And lots of people are harmed and killed in the process. Lash can be systemic. Lashing out happens as an understandable, natural response to harm, but is part of the process of healing. Anger enables us to express our pain, and that's part of the healing. We're called to name our hurt. Desmond Tutu talks about that as well. So we're not to say that anger is wrong when we feel hurt, but we're to recognize that it can become systemic. It can become something that is passed down. And the root of healing this is to seek forgiveness. And no, it is not easy, and no, this is not a simple answer. But individually and collectively, we need to figure out how to move forward without seeing each other as an enemy. I want to highlight for you this image, which I sent out to you during the week. It is by Reverend Lauren Wright Pittman, and I'm going to read for you what she wrote about this. And the title of this image is 77. She says, in this mandala, I wanted to follow a person through the process of reproval, forgiveness, reconciliation, and restoration, as Jesus describes in Matthew 18. In the center, a person is standing alone, isolated, with their arms crossed in a closed-off posture. If you're sinned against, Jesus says, to go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. When you move to the second ring of the mandala, there are pairs of people shaking hands and finding common ground, or at least attempting to. And if this doesn't work, then you're to bring more people together to provide counsel and witness. In the third ring of the mandala, two people are engaging with a closed-off person. They're sharing a way forward. In the next ring, hyacinth flowers, which represent sorrow and regret and forgiveness. They stretch and they bloom and they grow, bringing beauty into now open arms of the people in the last ring of the mandala, who are embraced and woven into the community. The person from the center goes from being alone and closed off to embraced and open. She says, when I was drawing the figures from the center out, it began to look like a dance. Is this the picture that grace paints? Forgiveness cannot happen in isolation, and certainly neither can reconciliation nor restoration. The movement towards wholeness is a movement toward one another. Perhaps craving more tangibility and practicality, Peter asks how many times he should forgive someone who has wronged him. And Jesus says, not 7, but I tell you 77 times. This piece contains 77 people and flowers to represent the abundance of grace that Jesus calls us into. The gold represents the divine presence of empathy, compassion, grace, and love throughout this dance, from isolation towards community, from brokenness towards wholeness, and from guilt and shame toward freedom. I think that's beautiful. Maybe you're standing at the center. Maybe you're somebody who is in the outer rings, hoping to welcome somebody back into community. I can't stand here before you and tell you you have to forgive when I still have to work on forgiveness myself. But I do think that we are called to work on forgiveness, to remember that Jesus has said, you are forgiven and therefore you are called to forgive. And so I want to read for you this prayer from the Book of Forgiving. It's a book by Desmond Tutu, and it's called The Prayer Before the Prayer. The prayer before let me find it. The prayer before the prayer. I want to be willing to forgive, but I dare not ask for the will to forgive in case you give it to me, and I am not yet ready. I am not yet ready for my heart to soften. I am not yet ready to be vulnerable again. Not yet ready to see that there is humanity in my tormentor's eyes, or the one who hurt me may also have cried. I am not yet ready for the journey. I'm not yet interested in the path. I am at the prayer before the prayer of forgiveness. Grant me the will to want to forgive. Grant it to me, not yet soon. Can I even form the words, forgive me? Dare I even look? Do I dare to see the hurt I have caused? I can glimpse all the shattered pieces of the fragile thing, that soul trying to rise on the broken wings of hope. But only out of the corner of my eye. I'm afraid of it. And if I am afraid to see, how can I not be afraid to say, forgive me? Is there a place where we can meet, you and me, the place in the middle, the no man's land where we straddle the lines, where you are right and I am right too, and both of us are wrong and wronged? Can we meet there and look for the place where the paths begin, the path that ends when we forgive? Amen.